Good afternoon. I am Ali Amida, Department of Political Science, and one of the professors who teaches human tradition at UNE for a long, long time. And this talk is sponsored by the programs at UNE that teach the human traditions. Many of us in various programs, political science, history, philosophy, English, and we all get together, annually and discuss how to coordinate and how to assess and how to really expand and tighten and revise and assess the teaching of human traditions at UNE. Keep in mind that we call it at UNE human traditions. Other universities will call it heritage, will they call it core. Even some are stuck in the old core, Western core vis-a-vis the rest of humanity. So there are all kind of ways of teaching this core. At UNE, we call it human traditions, and we used to call it roots, which is not a bad name either. The professors who are teaching the human traditions last year taught about ways of really enriching our debate and discussions, and also expose our students and faculty to new current teaching and thinking about the core, and specifically the course human traditions. And we were really honored and delighted that Professor Peter Gran from Temple University agreed to join us and share with us his thinking, his experience and reflections about teaching human traditions at UNE. Professor Gran is a good friend of mine. I have known him for many years, since graduate school. And I read his seminal classical work, Islamic Roots of Capitalism, which is a very, very innovative argument about reading Islamic history, not as a footnote, not as catching up with progress, but also that modernity and modernization and capitalism had its roots in many societies. And then that book was published in 1979, translated into Arabic, and got really wide reception in Egypt. Professor Gran in 1996 published another major work, which is called Beyond Eurocentrism. And he, in this book, tried to first give a critique of the whole assumption and methodology called Eurocentrism, and propose alternative way of how to teach world history by looking at comparative examples in many, many continents and many societies, as they are really interconnected and interlinked together. In the year 2009, he published his most recent work. It's called The Rise of the Rich. And I love that title because it's really playing with the old paradigm. Professor McNeil, who was at the University of Chicago, eminent professor of history, he has a book called The Rise of the West, with a thesis that has been very, very dominant in our higher education and our national discourses. So he tried to provoke that title, but propose a different way of thinking about the rise of the West, linked to only Western Europe. Professor Gran is going to share with us his thinking about these really national issues and related to us at UNE, which is the teaching of human traditions. I am honored and delighted to have him here. And he is going to talk with us for maybe 40 minutes or so, and then we'll be having discussions and comments about his presentation. And his talk today is called Teaching Heritage / Human Traditions in a Changing Context. Without further ado, Professor Peter Gran.
Oh, good afternoon. Thanks for coming out to talk about this issue. I'd like to start with a word or two of thanks. As Professor Ali Ahmida said, many, many years we've been colleagues. Dr. Ali is the country's leading expert on modern Libyan history, and he is the chief challenger to interpretations of North Africa, which has gotten erased from the American mental horizons. We don't really deal with North Africa. And most recently in his current work, which I think would interest a very wide range of people, he's challenging our understanding of distinguishing Italian and German fascism, which seems like such a comfortable intellectual idea in the American context, but which his information shows is going to need some sort of revision. I am also in debt to the core course committee, which handles the human traditions here at UNE, and thank them for choosing me, and Dr. Jean Hay, the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, all of whom contributed to this invitation. My wife and I are very appreciating the hospitality that Dr. Ali and his wife have been giving us these days. So I'll begin with a short paragraph in which I'll sort of explain what I would like to talk about today, and it winds up with a question which I'm going to sort of leave you with to think about at the end of the hour, and I hope that in the course of time somebody would send me emails commenting on what their opinions of the question might be. So I'll start like this. Back in the day when I was a student, I used to think that heritage as a field was what it always was, while history was what was changing. Later, when I started to become a teacher, I realized both were changing and both were frantically adapting and adjusting to the conditions of their times. And then later on, I realized maybe if you wanted to get a sense of where the heritage course was going in America, it'd be a good idea to know the history of how it had gotten up to that point. And this is my take on what I want to do today. So my question, which I want to sort of end the hour with, and I don't know how it will go, is when you become teachers, educators, parents, and so forth, in the next decade or so, what would you teach if you were teaching this class, and or what would you want your children to learn if they were coming to UNE or a school like UNE to study? In other words, how do you imagine human traditions and the kind of interpretation that would go with it? How would it change for your generation? So I now, as Dr. Ali said, I'm a historian, so I'll give you the background, how we got to where we are today, and and then I will tell you my views of where I hope human traditions would go. So the course began historically in its modern form at Columbia University during World War I, and it was introduced there at that time as part of the war effort. The American public opinion was not terribly interested in becoming involved in World War I. And so my course begins with a characterization of that original version of the course. Then I jump up to the more contemporary version of the course, the one which you're part of, which arose in the era of multiculturalism and has sort of continued in different forms up until now. And then, as I said before, I'll conclude offering a perspective where the course might go based on the new reality, which I think is the new reality of your time, if I was to put words in your mouth, and that is with the rise of the 1%. We're now confronting what I think is a newer age of history, one with yet different challenges, and therefore, from my point of view, new responsibilities from the point of view of rethinking the meaning of heritage. So back to the more familiar world that I think I've studied since I was a child, the World War I version. It was faced with the mechanical problems of how on earth could you limit such a wide subject, and the professors decided to make it a few parts of the Bible, a few things from the Greeks, the Romans, a bit of the art of the Renaissance, something drawn from the Enlightenment, something about the Industrial Revolution, something more topical, and then there was the proverbial week 14 of the course, 15-week course, would be the non-West week, and it would take up Asia or African culture. And the course was, as you could imagine, basically a Western Civ class, and its hallmark was the rise of the West, and which was virtually synonymous with the rise of the Western middle class and with the rise of the Western nation state, and simultaneously, and more generally, with progress in modernity. All these ideas were combined together. And so the course was, in many senses, a college-level civics class. The approach to teaching involved very little questioning of anything because it was already true and you already knew it. And so, to a considerable extent, whatever you may have encountered in week 14 was more or less incidental. And the course appears to have served the needs of the United States education system from World War I up to the 1960s, which has sometimes been called in history books the age of the melting pot. And the course was a big part of that. And it tried to make everybody who came here, immigrants in particular, give them a positive collective identity through this heritage. And the universities made the course a requirement. And as a result, the size of the classes ballooned enormously. And the professors developed textbooks, and the students had to memorize stuff in the textbooks. Now, shifting to the 1970s and beyond. There is, in my mind, some question, as this is not written about in any kind of way that I could find that I could count on, about when, why, and to what extent the original version of the course ever broke down. Doubtless change has come thanks to the racial and gender struggles of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, which led to multiculturalism, and doubtless as well it had something to do with the decline of the American middle class, a class which believed that it was a part of, or perhaps even the culmination of, the rise of the West. Whatever the case may be on that point, professors, once again, did what they could to adjust the course to the changing context, and this is what, in fact, is still going on. In what follows, I'll briefly discuss three such adjustments, which for me stand out as perhaps the most important ones of the past half century. I wonder if my colleagues would agree that I'm making the correct choices here. First, the first one is, how do we discuss and present the subject of imperialism? Second, how do we acknowledge diversity while at the same time maintaining the unity of the course? And third, how do we deal with Eurocentrism? As regards imperialism, my first point, perhaps most of you have studied or remember the strange way the Vietnam War ended and how a new kind of American political economy appeared. In this transition, imperialism went from being regarded as something barbaric during the war years to being something to be proud of thereafter, rebranded as it was globalization. For many of the professors, this adjustment was not that easy to stomach. It seemed for some that the very idea of globalization was gibberish, that what had happened was that we had replaced Europe as the center of neocolonial exploitation. The majority, however, thought otherwise, although many were ambivalent, and ambivalence continues until today. And it's a feature of the teaching of this class that many of the professors who teach it are rather deeply ambivalent about the subject that they are teaching. In any case, as this rehabilitation of imperialism progressed, still other adjustments were called for. Professors realized that if everything was to be global and local, we're no longer living in the age of nation states and national identities. The two would somehow be at odds. Therefore, nationalism and nation states should no longer be considered to be as important as they had been earlier. Some professors reached far back into the past, recalling that the nation state was imposed by the West, that it was not indigenous to most countries. And what was indigenous, at least in the current opinion, was religion. Others pointed out that if one went that route, and if one assumed that Westerners are secular nation builders while others are religious, this makes us more colonial than post-colonial. This is a typical kind of way of thinking. It would be as if we were following Lord Cromer or Bernard Lewis or others of their sort. Do we really want to recycle colonial binaries, that is, oppositions of East and West, in the old way that it once was in the 19th century in the Middle East? In other words, do we want Middle Easterners to have religious identities? And the answer is some people still do, as the Iraq War and its proponents make clear. Okay, let us move on and now to our second point, that of how professors attempted to adjust the course to accommodate greater diversity. Here one could note that nobody uses textbooks anymore, that everybody has constructed diverse syllabi and encourages diverse ways of reading what is on the syllabus. This too has brought with it its ambiguities, and the reason being that to retain some sort of commonality, which is something of a necessity, professors have to try to hold on to the idea of being Western, meaning European, but as they realize, they have to do so without being Eurocentric, and this is where the ambiguity comes in. It was so much easier before 1970. A professor could assign Afro-Asian novel or religious text for week 14. Having done so, it would be logical to impose on it an exoticized interpretation to make the rest of the course seem more European. After 1970, with diversity as a part of the mandate, the text one assigns brings with it a presumption there are multiple readings to be considered. It's not simply, for example, how one reads a part of the Quran, but how others do. And there are multiple different ways in which others do. But given the acceptance of imperialism, but at the same time, given the belief that others have a voice through interpretation, meaning they're not subaltern, there arises a question: how can one listen to what those other voices are saying to us and still support imperialism, meaning our right to plunder? This is what I think underlies the ambivalence of post-colonial discourse in general and the ambivalence about the issue of Eurocentrism, to which we now turn. This is my interpretation of post-colonial discourse. That is the ambivalent side of it, skipping, of course, the new ideas or insights it brings. For some, Eurocentrism is a pseudo-problem. No major adjustment is required. If by accident one attributes too much weight or importance to European things, this can be resolved. It can be corrected. You can go from Eurocentrism to a correct level of Eurodominance. What I now would like to suggest is, regrettably, it's more difficult. Dealing with Eurocentrism is rather complicated. It's not just what you're saying about somebody else, it's what you're saying also about yourself. And this is, I think, also part of the roots of why people are sort of ambivalent when they get into the subject of Eurocentrism in the universities, and why they're happy to continuously have conferences in which they're saying going beyond Eurocentrism. In other words, this is a genre of conference which you see. And it's because the feeling of ambivalence, people want to sort of go beyond the subject. So you could say, here I repeat, that it's a non-issue. We're Europeans, we're Euro-Americans, meaning we're Westerners, we're done. But in saying this, unknowingly perhaps, we're in trouble. Does Europe actually mean the West? And I'll have to sort of explain this through the talk. Our answer is likely to be a bit mushy. Basically, no. But it's not, but yes, it does mean that, but no, it doesn't. On the no side, since the West is another word for progress, the rise of the West really only applies to select parts of Europe at select moments, not to everything at all times. This leaves then the question as to what is the relationship of the West to Europe as a whole? Are those other parts of Europe and those other times still Western, that is still rising, still progressing, still part of the syllabus, or should we forget them? Or are we getting to a place where there's Europe on the one hand and the rise of the West on the other? This is an ambiguity. It's an ambiguity in terms of who we say we are. On the affirmative side, I gave you the negative side. Of course, we're European Western. Who else could we be? To illustrate this dilemma, let me give as an example the way we might treat Florence at the end of the Renaissance. At that point, Florence was controlled by Savonarola, And he was burning Renaissance art in carnivals, the most famous of which was in 1497, and is known to history as the Bonfire of the Vanities. Burning Botticelli's artwork was a famous event. As this was occurring, however, we almost face, in the teaching of the class, the question of whether the Italy of Savonarola was still Western. But the Heritage course avoids the question and moves north towards Germany and the Reformation, which is, of course, what it should do. But it's running away and missing out on exactly what our reasoning is in what we're doing. The Renaissance is supposed to be a part of the rise of the West. Florence was supposed to be the center. So how does one interpret Florence under Savonarola? Was it an aberration, or was its Western identity burned out? And if so, was Florence Western at that point? And here we're back to yes and no. Yes, of course, Florence is part of the rise of the West. And this would be the case if it never rose, never did anything, and just stayed the way it stayed. But if by West we mean modern, and if we mean modern and progressive, of course we're going to the Reformation. We're not staying there. But if we mean modern and progressive, wouldn't it be logical in that time frame to not necessarily go to Germany, but go to Tunisia and deal with Ibn Khaldun, the father of modern sociology? He died in 1406, had a lot of 4 or 5 people followed him, creating a kind of early school of historical sociology. If, on the other hand, by the West, we actually mean Europe and we don't mean modern, then shouldn't we drop the idea of West as modernity or progress and cover European culture and history as it actually was? To avoid imprecision, it's one or the other. But to repeat, we don't usually look into this because the course has moved on to Martin Luther's Wittenberg. For some professors, of course, the hope is that you could have it both ways. One could have a heritage class which was non-Eurocentric if one tolerated many renaissances around the world, and some people do that. Assuming that our real heritage, we Westerns, was bound up in the present-day world hegemony and military power. But if we go that route, there's problems too. We would lose our connection or justification for studying origins. Why would anyone who takes that approach want to study what the Greeks thought about the good life or what the Christians thought about the afterworld? Why not simply run a current events class? And I think herein lies a little bit of an ambiguity. In other words, there are features, which I'm going to argue in the second half of the paper, which make us stay with the word West and make us imbue that word with quite a few normative attributes. And this given attempt to impose this on Europe is a very interesting and complicated and confusing part of the baggage we carry around. So in sum then, about our present-day situation, the positive side of the contemporary approach to teaching is it gets beyond the homogenization I was talking about by using these themes and multiple perspectives. This makes us aware that there's a connection between maybe globalization and Eurocentrism, and this is good. Even up to now, we've not been able to get much beyond inducing ambivalence. At least we're becoming aware there is a paradigm crisis. Now I turn to my third point. My third point takes up the question of what is our relevant heritage given prevailing conditions and given the frustrations professors face using current approaches. I think at the present time we have 2 relevant constructions of our heritage or collective identity to try to work out, or human traditions, to use your phrase. The first is our human heritage in the wide sense. The overwhelming majority of us are a part of the human struggle to survive in the face of the growing concentration of wealth and power taking place in the world. The human struggle connects us to the entire world of workers, peasants, and middle classes such as they still exist. The second construction of our heritage has to do with our life in one particular form of hegemony. We live in a democracy. We cherish it because it gives us rule by law and other bourgeois liberties which some other forms of hegemony don't. However, of the various forms of hegemony in the world, it appears that this This form of hegemony is the most endangered one because there's no assurance of economic need for much of a middle class in the future. So I now want to go into the part on the human heritage. I'll begin with characterizing today's political economy and conclude with comments about the implications for classroom teaching. As I see it, those who have power today turn out to be a mesh of dominant elements in different countries all over the world, which are loosely allied to one another. By that, I mean that there are individuals and entities which cooperate with each other, at least when it comes to keeping capitalism going. Among these are linkage figures who help the system evolve, and there are those who embody the existing system, from the states and the corporations, the international merchants, banks, investment scheme operators, kings, dictators, religious hierarchies, media personalities, and assorted other random personalities inside and outside the law. These share in common a desire to keep the masses down and to extract as much profit as can be possibly extracted. Now, whether it's student loans here or debt capitalism in some other country, there is a huge international skillful network out there day and night attempting to try to sort of concentrate wealth based on opportunity. To characterize the evolution of this mesh of individuals and entities, I've been using the phrase rise of the rich to get away from the rise of the West, as Dr. Ali said. The term is not entirely original and not entirely explanatory, as by rich, I'm alluding both to power and not just to money. And what I am finding important is not illuminated in this title. What I'm finding important is that we've forgotten how important third world rulers are to running the world plunder regimes, and how even the poorest countries the rulers from them are more powerful on a world scale than are the vast majority of us in the Western countries, whether we have money or not. This idea was a new one to me. It occurred to me one day in Philadelphia a bunch of years ago when I was trying to make sense of an article in our local paper which was talking about somebody from some minor African ruling family who came to Pennsylvania, jumped to the head of the queue in some hospital, received an organ transplant, and left. He made the operation and just disappeared. He was basically a foreigner gaining access to a desperately needed body part. This had to come about, I came to think, not just because of money. There's money in Pennsylvania, but because of the architecture of existing global connections. Back home, his family helped corporations, and this made him a privileged person wherever he went. This made him more powerful than the people in the queue, whom I'm assuming were Americans of varying levels of wealth and influence. This gave me a totally different idea of who I was in the world than what I had had when I was basically more in the kind of rise of the West kind of modality. Conventional historiography has never gone the way I'm just saying, and liberal or Marxist. Third world rulers are never imagined to be powerful, yet, as my anecdote suggests, they frequently are. Often, as my research in then later years showed, they even hire lobbyists to add a line here or there to some bill in Congress. And it turns out in Washington, D.C., over a good number of years, there's a large number of both foreign lobbyists and American lobbyists working for foreign interests. And this is long before the era of Donald Trump. And there's very little written about this, actually. Maybe I found a few political science articles. I didn't find a single historical monograph on the role of the foreign lobbyists in the United States when I was doing the research. The best article was by a Korean-American political scientist. In using the rise of the rich in my teaching, which I've been doing since the last 10 or 15 years, I found that the easier part of transitioning into what amounted to a new storyline was that of locating sources. The harder part was the elaborating of the theory. This may just be me. I don't know. In terms of source material, a good deal is readily available. I can go into this if anybody wants me to. At some juncture, I eventually realized while elaborating the theory that for the vast human majority, capitalism was a system of plunder, that it was only to a much lesser extent what I had earlier thought it to be, a system of production and exchange. This led to the thought that what we celebrate as an industrial revolution or some iteration of it today was for somebody else a high point of slavery or neo-slavery and colonialism. And as I went deeper into the rise of the rich as a paradigm, what also became apparent was that the role played by white men has been greatly overstated, and this should no longer be perpetuated in our humans, traditions, classes. The world of today, in which I grew up, came as much from the struggles of women from the 16th century to escape from being unpaid housewives, and from the struggles of African Americans to escape from bondage, as from that of the white male working class. As a result of all these struggles, however unsuccessful some of them may have been, human beings like ourselves have the heritage that we have. And it seems to me that would be, I'm now an ex-heritage teacher because of our structure, but this is the way in which I sort of teach it in my history classes. Now, given the constraints of time, let's turn from considering heritage in relationship to world capitalism to heritage as stemming from life in a particular kind of political system of hegemony, which are two sides of the same general subject. So now taking a sort of political approach, I'm assuming that all states, our own included, can be characterized that by their fact that they make use of one form of hegemony or another, that each of these forms of hegemony makes some use of persuasion, some use of coercion, and to a greater or lesser extent, it propagates certain kinds of ideas about heritage. And so we're in that kind of an arena. What I found through research on this subject was that there are basically four and only four forms of hegemony used by the modern nation state. And one could study them maybe in comparative political science or in comparative historical sociology. That's where the best books are. Each has its ways of deflecting class conflict. Democracy is one of these four. Democracy is the one which uses race to deflect class conflict. And the famous book is by the American historian W.B. Du Bois called Black Reconstruction. This is the one that explains how structural racism can exist side by side with the affirmation of bourgeois rights. Other theorists have added later insights about democracy, and some have noted, and this coming from a third world context, that the democratic countries seem to be disproportionately powerful. And one hypothesis put forward for this is that they strongly, perhaps even irrationally, support each other no matter what. If some politician from one of these 6 or 8 countries announces that given some crisis we now need to make the world safe for democracy, all the other 6 or 8 frequently join in. No other such alliance among the rise of the rich exists in modern times. It's quite frightening to the majority of people who are not part of those particular 6 or 8. In recent times, as I was saying, our democratic form is being perceived to be no longer so useful, and as you can see, there's been no particular rise in wages for a long time, and many other inconveniences confront the American population of the last generation into your times. And so it's in this framework that you're teaching heritage. As I noted before, there's some indications that capitalism no longer wants to support a middle class. The work perhaps can be done by technology or outsourcing, so that there are no longer the same compelling reasons to give out benefits of freedom of speech or rule by law and so on. This means in a university context, we're today facing a problem here in the U.S. that we may be teaching human traditions that the country may be in the process of abandoning. And so I want to see if you agree with that idea. And the reason being the result of the 1% through its front organizations into the political arena. By front organizations, I mean in particular ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. Currently, as probably many of you know, ALEC is pushing with some success for a constitutional convention going state to state to rewrite the American Constitution to get rid of impediments to its class aspirations, perhaps to turn us into a classical republic. If ALEC succeeds, I don't think some of us will still be teaching, and those of us who won't be teaching the same syllabus we're teaching today. I mentioned to go on now, there are 4 and only 4 forms of hegemony to come to terms with. And I think it's a good idea as a college student to learn something about these different 4 forms. So I'll conclude by identifying them and returning to the problem of how this impacts on understanding ourselves in the world and heritage in general. Democracy is one form. The second form is commonly called Italian Road. Its rulers play off class against region. Of course, region, like race in the American context, has been useful as a stratifying device everywhere. But here I'm referring to countries whose ruling classes have made region their primary technique in stratification. In those countries, of which modern Italy is the textbook example, the rulers have bunched the industrial working class in the north and fed it propaganda prejudicing it against the southern workers, most of whom are peasants. Southerners get pictured as barbarians. Of course, we find the same thing here, but it runs along more racial lines. If you turn on the media, they say, look at the immigrants. They're swarthy, they smuggle drugs, they're rapists, they're terrorists. Some people of some races will work for nothing. And so long as the masses of American workers believe this kind of Archie Bunker type of racial line stuff, or the masses of Italians workers believe this, the systems are secure. What the details of the systems will be is less certain, but the systems themselves are secure. And the propaganda framework, which produces this kind of idea of who we are and who we aren't, begins from one's infancy. A third form of hegemony in the world is very much deceives American political science and American thought in general. It's based on rule by gender. In these regimes, common sense tells you it's a man's world, that a male worker naturally has more in common with his boss, who's another man, than he does with a woman of his own class, maybe even his wife. It ought not be a surprise that if women won the vote in most countries in the whole world before World War II, in the tribal ethnic states, they only got it in more recent times, like Switzerland in 1971, which is if you think Switzerland is a sophisticated country, but the hegemony defines the gender relations. And a fourth form of hegemony, the Russian road, it's one wherein the ruler invents a hierarchy of fictive communities as a way of legitimating the favoritism shown to one, the ethnic Russians, whose working class is corrupted by being exposed to propaganda, demeaning the working class of the less privileged communities, which of course it otherwise would share a great deal with. Looking at the challenge of getting along in a world community of this sort, and this is where the heritage class comes in, what I found was that given the idea we have of ourselves as being Westerners or chosen people, to go back to that theme, it's easy for us to make enemies, and we've made many. Over the past century or so, some of our enemies have come from the Russian road states where typically the government plays a very large role, which from our point of view, we interpret it to mean they diminish individual freedom and morality, and we cannot coexist with that. Hence, we have these kind of endless altercations with not only Russia, but many other countries on the same structure: China, Iran, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and there are still others, Iraq, and there are still others. As for the tribal ethnic states, the gender ones, like South Korea and Vietnam, we often assume they're not real countries, and therefore they need a protector. We step in as protector. This misapprehension on our part allows us to be dragged into the Korean and Vietnamese wars, to name two. Now we're in Afghanistan, Niger, the Horn of Africa, and no doubt other places where we're also being hoodwinked by local power structures as we have been in the past. As for the Italian road, our impression is that as chosen people and so on, we're dealing with essentially governments with large bureaucracies, which means they're corrupt, and it means basically we have a condescending view about how civilized they are, and they frequently dupe us. And so the Italys, the Egypts, the Mexicos, the Nigerias, the India, and so on, frequently hold their own in diplomacy based on our racial stereotypes. Now to sum up, I began with my talk with the idea that the rise of the West and its various iterations have outlived their usefulness as the basis for teaching human traditions. I found the idea of the rise of the rich to be more useful because it alerts us to the heritage we share with all those who are being victimized, as we ourselves are being victimized by the concentration of wealth and power in today's world. Reconstructing our understanding of heritage to reflect this fact seems like a way to wake up the society in what is actually today a time of crisis. It also alerts us to some of the challenges involved. Among these challenges are the following. It's going to be really difficult to look abroad and connect with other people while adopting the stance we do, that we and we alone are Westerners, meaning chosen people. As scholars of American studies point out, however, it will not be so easy for us to put that aside. Our ancestors who conquered North America committed genocide. We don't want to teach our heritage that way. We want to teach our heritage that our ancestors were pilgrims, pioneers, a part of the rise of the West, chosen people, and yes, collateral damage unfortunately occurred. Yet, to preserve ourselves in the conditions in which we are now living, and particularly you, the students' generation, it seems to me we have to find a way to go beyond the sort of chosen people ideology, which is so off-putting. You cannot expect other people to go into relationships in which you announce you are the chosen people, you are Westerners, and somebody else is non-Westerners. This is simply too insulting. So perhaps for us, and this is I end up here, perhaps for us, the way to sort of get beyond the sort of chosen people ideology, we need now to have an era of truth and reconciliation in the way that various countries have set up commissions and so forth. And for a generation or more, we perhaps might need to, in our heritage classes and our conceptions of who we are, incorporate the heritage of the first Americans and make that part of our heritage and acknowledge our North American roots as a more central part of who we are today. There's a bunch of books out there which sort of run along that line. Permit me now in the last couple of seconds to conclude here expressing my hopes on some of these matters. I hope that we Americans have a desire to play a role in the general attempt of humans to survive the threats posed by the 1%. Finally, I hope that our heritage and human traditions professors will find their voice and use it in this struggle. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter, for very much a tour de force, surveying the history of the teaching of the core and also the problems associated with it, the silences and the ambivalence, and also hopefully with a semi-positive note at the end about where we go from here. So I think Peter gave us a lot of ideas, a lot of questions, and it's time for comments and questions. Megan.
In regards to your use of the phrase rise of the rich, do you think that there's like a more inclusive term that isn't like Westerners, but also like includes those who were raised with like this idea of like Westerners versus the idea of like the other?
I'm looking objectively at power positions in the world. So what I thought was that, well, you could say that you could teach a class and say we're all Westerners by virtue of our geographical location. If you connect that idea with power, science, progress, modernity, particularly when you get to the power end of it, power is spread around through many different structures and individuals. And that was the point of the story I told about the getting an operation in Pennsylvania. And so the issue is, I think we need to sort of drive the issue of, do we want the word West to carry all this freight and weight, or are we content to say we're partly Africans and partly Latin Americans and partly Asians and partly Europeans of different sorts? Are we prepared to say our heritage is quite literally what a historian could present? What we are existing in is this kind of, I think, untenable situation where what we could empirically say we are has been sort of combined with this sort of metaphysical series of ideal things, and I think the problem for us has always been that we've not been able to talk about our origins with any degree of comfort.
Nicholas.
Hi. As you suggested, so if there was different structures,
Yeah.
are you endorsing the Foucauldian philosophy of like one postmodern power as being very diffuse and very everywhere in society? And so how to articulate that with the fact that 1% are those who are indeed those power?
Okay, I'm not a Foucauldian, and I'm closer to third world political economy. I have more of a class-centered view of things. I decline to use the word class in some of the discussion because I'm dealing with so many entities that other people don't associate with class power, and because my sort of roots in political economy, apart from third world political economy, are Gramscian hegemony ideas, that I just went to what I would regard as a neologism. Nobody uses the word rise of the rich as a way to sort of like alert people to the idea that I'm trying to say something different. I don't like Foucault because of the indeterminacy. I don't like Foucault because of basically there's no praxis of any significance, and that in effect he's a writer of the status quo, for the status quo, filled with the ambivalences about how lamentable power abuse is in the actual world. It's a kind of continuation of sort of a Nietzschean type of view. I think this offers guidance to nobody. I mean, except for very privileged people. I think what I'm looking for is a language in which you could speak to the working class of the third world. And I'm looking, okay, so what do we have to get rid of out of, it's not that I'm asking you to learn foreign languages, that might be a good idea too, but I'm saying what are some of the English words that you don't want to use, and what are the ways you want to sort of reconstruct how you understand yourself and therefore how you relate to other people. So long as we can't do that, it seems to me we're up against the 1% that easily combines with the rest of the world, and here we are sitting in this box over here in this one country.
More questions and comments. Come on, guys. James.
So, Professor, I guess I'd be curious how would you incorporate, I'm just thinking about free trade as being a major political issue in the world today. And oftentimes it just made me think of the question, because your statement was capitalism has really been a sort of means of plunder for the vast majority of people. And it made me think of free trade because, of course, it's on the news and all sorts of forms after the strait of the U.S. and China. And oftentimes it gets played out as sort of either economic rationalism versus protectionism, these sort of big narrative terms. And yet, when you look at it, right, I mean, oftentimes it's the poor farmers in Mexico that deal with the biggest portions of NAFTA, as well as the low-skilled blue-collar workers in the U.S.
Right.
Right? And so I guess if you were incorporating that to a heritage course, I mean.
Well, I think that I'm saying a couple of things that for our students, how they're going to teach heritage might be a bit different than how we are. In other words, we are heir to a certain kind of generation, education kind of structure. And so I don't think our students are going to inherit very directly what we teach because the world is so shockingly, changingly different. So I think the kind of what we call free trade, the issue of our relations with China, our prosperity and so forth, is really kind of the icing on the top of a cake, and the so many deep structural problems of who else is involved in this kind of capitalist production who are getting hurt. In other words, one of the principal features of the 20th century and late 19th into the present is not the rise of poverty, but the rise of destitution. As people through the ages have always, there are a large number of people who didn't live with a lot of money, but the sheer number of people who are what you would call reduced to being beggars or starving is what's sort of growing now. And so the language, if one was to sort of get outside of the sort of elite, let's say, of Mexico City, and deal with some of the people you're talking about, maybe you went to the, I don't know, the center of the country and went to these sort of provincial towns or something like this, the language you would want to be able to talk would have something to do with the general situation of peasants and farmers and the relationship to landowners. And so the issue of the ultimate price of the coffee or whatever you're drinking is really simply the tip of the iceberg. So I think for the Americans who are interested in a human future, taking that kind of general idea, we want a language in which we can sort of like work out what that will be. And at this point in time, it's a little bit hard. We're in a kind of awkwardly privileged construction of the world. At the same time, we're not so privileged. So there's a great deal that would have to be sort of worked out. What I think we can do in this kind of a course is to alert people to this and give them a chance to think about the language they would need to be able to communicate. Maybe a new generation would be better with the internet than we are and would be teaching their class with a bunch of kids in El Salvador or something like this. Maybe, you know, the whole structure of education pedagogy would be changing. But as teachers in this transitional period, I want to see if we can open the door to that deeper conversation. As I'm not sure that capitalism can last another century. As we know it. I'm not sure of that at all. I don't think the ecology is on our side, and I think this is the kind of conversation that implies that we can be part of a conversation with a bunch of other people, and things like can we cross class lines? In other words, very, very few of my students would feel comfortable talking to workers and peasants, I would say. And they could do it if they thought about it, but they're used to the sort of plateau of language and thought and culture which they grew up in. Yeah.
Very interesting talk.
Thank you.
Bringing together a lot of things, both how we teach this material, but also sort of like interpretive frameworks that we all use. I'm really curious about this idea of the rise of the rich, and I wonder if you can just expand on that maybe just a little bit. So one of the core ideas that seems to be involved in this idea of thinking in terms of the rise of the rich is to just think in terms of power relations.
Coagulation of powerful entities which would surprise you because they're in different parts of the world, and would surprise you because you wouldn't think that there would be brokers who could in some sort of sense bring them together in what in early modern history was more like bilateral connections, and later on in the later middle 19th century and beyond, multiple treaties began to sort of give this category of the dominant groups in the world a sense of confidence. They began to parade around in public spectacles in the late 19th century, as in Berlin and so on, and then creating world organizations in the 20th century. All this evolved through amazing sort of subterranean growth of connections. I'll just tell you, I took Samuel Flagg Bemis's U.S. diplomatic history class in college, and maybe in the 19th century I learned 5 or 6 treaties out of the 20 that he assigned, being not the most energetic student there ever was. And more recently, when I was doing the research for Rise of the Rich, maybe take a look at it. It's not that long a book. You could read it online. It's in Project Muse. I discovered the U.S. was signatory to more than 4,000 treaties in the middle of the 19th century. That's what one of the law review articles said. Most of them were private. I had no idea what they are. That's a lot of treaties. Okay, that mesh, connected, the power structure in this country to an awful lot of other things. I don't know any feasible way to do research about that. Maybe if you're a certain kind of lawyer, you could get into it. But it's a big jump to go from a textbook on U.S. foreign relations and treaties into the actual number of things that sort of exist out there. But this is what creates a world which I then call multilateral, ignoring the idea common in political science that multilateralism is a dream for the future. I'm saying it was a reality, and that's what gave rise to the modern capitalist nation states from the mid-19th century on.
So that's really helpful, because my question is this an idea that's meant to help us sort of interpret the whole sweep of human history, or there's something particular about?
I'm interested in 16th century modern world capitalism on. So I read Marx to mean that he meant to write a book about capitalism as world capitalism. He got distracted when he went to England, and he wrote mainly about, he mainly got into fights with the British political economist tradition. But in one of his notebooks, he says, I had a plan to write 7 books. He never did. And so I took, the sort of political economy tradition to be a lot more than what appeared in Capital, and which, so I feel, in some senses, this is how I was, when I realized this and I began to read other people, I began to realize that Americans read Marx like they read Freud, like they read, they take what they like. And this is how we absorb these traditions. But other countries, when they read Marx, they read it differently. So Samir Amin influenced me a certain extent in his discussions of plunder, and then the stuff written by the feminist tradition, and then C.L.R. James' stuff on slavery and the Industrial Revolution.
Naomi Klein, maybe. Naomi Klein.
Yes.
Recently.
Yeah. Right.
Environmentalism.
Naomi Klein's stuff on shock doctrine. I've used her stuff in class quite a bit. Learned quite a bit from her writing.
Okay, folks, more questions? Isaac, you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I think I do. You just talked about how people from other countries read differently. Can you kind of go into detail, like how do they read differently?
Sure. Well, of course, an answer to your question would be, that it's not the same in all different countries. And I tried to cover this sociologically a bit in the book I wrote, the Beyond Eurocentrism thing. But what you would want to answer your question, which I'm not going to be able to, I don't have the stamina to sit and talk to, you would want different kinds of countries following these different hegemonies. Then you would want a discussion of how do writers in these different countries treat liberalism, Marxism, Romanticism, and anarchism. In other words, how do they read the world classics? In other words, how do they read Shakespeare, Dostoevsky, writers which are sort of read around the world? How are they translated and commented on? This is a very interesting subject. But I'm just going to sort of retreat into a very sort of narrow sort of way of treating it and say, if you read the American magazines which will teach you political economy like Dollars and Cents or Monthly Review, you're by and large going to get this stuff, as I was saying, which teaches you how to read Capital. And then you can expand that. You go to the British books, and they do the same thing. And it's much centered in England, much centered in their Industrial Revolution. That's what capitalism is. And they will be quite annoyed if you say, actually, the money that created the world in which the Industrial Revolution took place came from elsewhere. There's a nice article trying to refute that idea. Now, shift to C.L.R. James, a West Indian, or Samir Amin, who's Egyptian, and they're quite clear about how is. Here's a very nice, easy thing you could read like in an afternoon, and I think you should impose this in some of your other classes. Read the book by Eduardo Galeano called Open Veins of Latin America. I assign like the 2 or 3 chapters of it in which it shows, he sort of says, he begins the book by saying, some countries are were born to win and others are born to lose. And okay, so you read that, and I teach it against something like Friedman's Lexus and the Olive Tree, which is how the world is getting better and how I find happiness everywhere I go. This is how I begin my class. I try to shock students into the way in which the same phenomenon can be seen radically differently. So then I'm saying to teachers here and now, and to you guys for the future is, okay, how do you develop a sense of ourselves, which is what this is all about, so that we can deal with people who basically we may actually need them and want to be with them in the future. In other words, I don't see the 1% giving up. I see them as a long developing and very, very, very dangerous and powerful phenomenon. And even if some of them are very liberal and nice, and give all kinds of charity money to any concert you want to go to, that doesn't change anything.
Let's have a question from this side. If not, I'm going to call one of my students to ask a question.
Actually, Ali, before you do,
You have another question?
I have lots of questions.
Yes.
I have restraints,
We'll have time later on as well, John. Remember.
So,
Yes, that's okay.
but so something you said, common interest, right? So there's this book that came out, it's got a lot of press recently, by Steven Pinker, right? Enlightenment Now.
Yes.
And in it, I mean, Pinker's like a really sort of creative guy, and he's got command of like a lot of data. And he just wants to present data, sort of from everything, health, well-being, equality, and democracy.
Yeah, yeah.
And the idea is just we are getting better, right? He wants to present a really sort of optimistic vision of like where we've been and where we're going.
Yeah.
I was just curious if you, and it is very much like the Enlightenment view of.
Correct, yeah.
I'm just curious if you
Well,
have some thoughts on this.
yes, I mean, the world of, say, Forbes and the Fortune 500 and that kind of stuff continuously publishes and publicizes this sort of thing. Like the World Bank, for example, says that poverty is declining in the world. And then when you examine what they mean, they've defined poverty in terms of, did you make $1.90 a day? And more people in the world now make $1.90 a day than before. So, however, then you go to the UN, which says, how are people in the world feeding themselves, getting health care? What is the likelihood of them getting education? What is the prospect of them finding places to live? Then you get very, very, different kinds of statistics. So the difficulty with sort of data projection lies in the definitions and the methodologies. What I'm observing is, depending on who you are and where you're placed in the world, you could throw this kind of stuff together, quite differently. And so, I think it would be natural for, books like what you're talking about to be bestsellers in airports and so forth, around this country. But I'm saying if you were to shift into say a Latin American university context or to a Middle Eastern context, where this would carry no weight whatsoever. In other words, different kinds of facts would and empirical realities would sort of like impose themselves. Like, for example, my line of work is in Egypt, and they're worried about running out of water, and nobody, the World Banks or anybody else or capitalists or anybody, have any idea what to do, and it's a pretty serious problem. Okay, so you would not find among people who are educated in that context, thinking about things, any claim that things are better. The general framework might be words like desperate, complete crisis. Some will blame the government, but many don't blame the government. They blame the historical conditions which the British set up a long time ago to favor, certain parts of their colonial world. They set up a certain kind of water regime. The water regime is inherently, unfair to some countries, and so other countries need water, and like the Ethiopians to make their dam and have some electricity. They have incredibly large numbers of starving people. And so, of course, the Egyptians also have these needs too. And so how you construct your kind of like narrative, I think you have to go back into the sort of meta-language and how you construct your facts and argument. And you can choose and you can choose, and you'll see different kinds of books talking about the same kind of reality. That's why, for example, just if you look at Third World Forum stuff, it's very different from Davis stuff, Porto Alegre type of that's a very simplistic, but it's one kind of polarity. I don't know. I look at this as kind of like, all right, this is the kind of stuff that you would teach in a heritage class in order to sort of have students critically look at. Teach it against something else. Because it just disconnects us from the reality that other people know about.
And I'm glad, John, you asked this question because
Yeah, those are good questions.
Yeah.
These are very important.
And very seductive in many ways.
Um,
Other questions? This side, I haven't forgotten about you, John. Bailed you a little bit. We're not going to leave unless you ask a question. I'm just joking here. I'm going to ask a question. I think what I'm getting from your talk today, Peter, is, especially for some of us who teach human tradition at UNE, there are a lot of good news because we are aware of the problem associated with teaching this course. So I think we are, maybe, as I always claim, we are ahead a lot of schools
Yes.
in that sense.
Yeah.
And our really inclination, our mindset in the right direction. What you are trying to, however, to push us to think is not ideas out of no roots, but look at the social and economic inequalities and context behind the ideas and the hegemonies that, as you used Gramscian perspective. My question is the following. In your first book, seminal book, in my opinion, you really reread and interpreted the rise of capitalism and in looking at it in a different way at Egyptian social and cultural history, the Islamic roots of capitalism.
Yeah.
In your last book, you are really trying to give a critique of the rise of the West, but also replace it via a different methodology, the rise of the rich,
Yeah.
especially after the 16th century. Now, where is the, I thought the first book tried to look at the political economy not as only an economic variable or concept, but also look at the culture too.
Yeah.
While in the rise of the West, I want to see where is the, I thought that really innovative way of thinking is maybe missing, or did I get it wrong? Where is the cultural and the new rise of the rich?
Well, I think that's a fair question. And to go back to your original remarks, I mean, the reason I put this talk together this way is I knew from talking with Dr. Ali that your program was innovative and you were trying to rethink things more than a lot of places. This would not be a suitable subject to sort of throw out in plenty of schools where the orthodoxy is more in place and students come, there's a list of books, you read them, and that's education. So now going back to what is the question really relates to two different kinds of books which I wrote that a gap of 20 or 30 years apart in my life, and the emphasis in the first book had to do with a struggle that was going on and still going on, in that you could not have, there's an idea which is still around, that there's a place called the Orient. This is a good word to get rid of out of your vocabulary. If you can think of some place you think is an Orient, then the issue might be to learn something about that and then get rid of that word. It's as bad a word as West, as a kind of polarity. But in Middle East studies, this idea is very concentrated. I'm a professor in that line of work. And so it's taken for granted that the subject exists, that there's some Orient, and that means that the coming of the West, because the West is this embodiment of everything, is terribly decisive, and this is how you sort of go about understanding things. These are really terrible ideas, but if you were to hire a professor in Middle East studies today, that would be probably the mindset that still exists. Maybe the language would be a little bit more sophisticated than what I'm putting it in, but roughly speaking, nothing much has changed in terms of the importance attributed to the coming of a general named Napoleon, whose troops plundered and stole everything they could do in the way that troops usually do. Napoleon seemed to be hoping somehow or another to luck out and find his way back into France as a kind of successful figure, maybe run France for a while. And he was fulfilling certain short-term objectives, such as France was short of food and a few other things. If he was a brilliant military strategist, you'd never know it, in that he risked his entire stupid army in boats floating across the Mediterranean when the British had a navy which was 10 times bigger, better, and the minute the British that he happened to fool them and happened to make it all the way across the Mediterranean and happened to get his troops landed. Shortly thereafter, the British show up and sink every single French ship. Predictable kind of thing. And then he's very surprised that the Egyptians resisted his occupation, and he has very good media coverage of the period, and we pick up on the French media coverage, and we call it scholarship today, in the Description de l'Egypte and other books which we call reference books and all that kind of stuff. So where I'm sort of going with this is when I wrote Islamic Roots of Capitalism, I was attempting to kind of like combat that by talking a little bit about the period in Egyptian cultural and history and political economy preceding Napoleon and then going on through it, and showing that basically you don't even need the subject of Napoleon to explain the development of modernity in Egypt. And that, yes, foreigners came and went, but as you would know if you read all this technical stuff, there had been Europeans in Egypt for centuries. There had never been a period in which there weren't people coming and going through Egypt. Egypt is a sort of convenient place for merchants and so forth to be. And so this issue of flattering Napoleon is a figment of the way in which historians chose to write. I hoped I would destroy that idea. I didn't. And so why didn't I? Well, Dr. Ali will perhaps have ideas about this, but people are obliged to read my book because it gained that level of notoriety, but it persuaded very, very few people. I can't identify continuators who were inspired to just sort of continue the row with Europeans about Napoleon. In other words, they're people that study the preceding period, but they stay within the period. All that is upsetting, vaguely personal, vaguely not personal, I don't know. The later book had something to do with the fact I was a McNeil student from Chicago. I read his book, The Rise of the West, which came out while I was a graduate student there. And I quarreled with him. He was a very brilliant, I guess, I don't know if he's still alive, he's very old. He's a brilliant man. He knows an enormous amount. He's very hard to quarrel with, and he never loses his temper, so he's good to quarrel with, but he won't give an inch. And so coming out of Chicago, as I did, I was very aware of the paradigm issue, and so the deal, it seemed to me, we could never have any kind of honest approach to world history unless we could get away from the rise of the West as the universal model, as the only model in town, which condemned my field, Egypt, into this Oriental despotism. That's another phrase which you don't want. Not only is there no such thing as Oriental, it's not a despotism. In addition, it has nothing to do with Pharaoh. In addition, it has nothing to do with the Old Testament. All these shortcuts, which you would think were the reality, turn out to be very misleading. Egypt is like Mexico; it's divided north and south, which isn't even that clear to a lot of people doing Mexico. The northerners in the country of Egypt oppress the southerners, like in Mexico, and this is a. This is a so the books were aimed at different kinds of ideological opponents. In other words, they were scientific books, but they were aimed at different kinds of traditions. And so I was not interested necessarily. Had I been interested, I would have pursued what I did in this talk. And the question which I had from you, which is how would different parts of the rise of the rich, given that they're in different kinds of hegemonies, function with ideas. In other words, how would the ideological quarrel within, say, liberalism work across the world? That would have been a good theme to have pursued. But having written, a lot of pages, I was more sensitive than I was in earlier times in my life, that it's important to have short books, not longer ones. So this I learned from my wife, who gave me some impressions about how undesirable it was to keep going at a certain point in time. So otherwise, my second book would have been even longer, I'm afraid.
I know mine is going to be short.
Yeah.
So that's I'm learning the lesson. I think I'm listening to you now is you are advocating that there the phrasing of reproduction or rephrasing of the rise of the West thesis, including maybe Picker's book, but also you're alerting us to see there are other counter arguments that exist in the United States and other societies that also counter that argument, and it's important whether whatever we do is to keep that in mind, that these arguments are trying to contest the dominant way of thinking about it. So that's really, I think, a very, very provocative and a very important thing to keep in mind. Any last comment or any last question, folks? Well, thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Peter, for coming to our campus.
Thanks for having me.
And have a good night.